When you enter into a relationship with a narcissist, one of the most disturbing and painful realizations, which often becomes clear far too late, is that you were never genuinely seen as a real person. You were not viewed as a complete human being with your own complicated inner world. Instead, you were observed, evaluated, measured, and assigned a specific role to fulfill. That role was not chosen because of your true personality or your authentic identity. It was selected entirely according to what you could provide to reinforce the fragile internal story they carry about themselves. This is the painful reality of this dynamic. To a narcissist, you are not approached as a complete individual with your own thoughts, emotions, and independence. You are treated more like an object, something that exists to satisfy a particular purpose. This is not some small or insignificant problem. It represents a profound failure of the basic human ability to build a sincere and authentic connection. It is the complete opposite of the kind of relationship Martin Buber described as the I-thou connection, where two people meet as equals and recognize the humanity within one another. A narcissist simply does not have the ability to engage in that way. Their entire psychological structure is organized around defense rather than genuine connection. They relate to other people primarily as instruments for their own emotional survival within their internal way of processing reality. You are not someone with your own dreams, desires, feelings, and identity. You become a mirror designed to reflect the exact image they need to believe about themselves. You become a mirror meant to reinforce their inflated sense of importance, their belief that they are naturally superior to others, or sometimes their deeply rooted conviction that they are always the innocent victim. Your role is to admire them, carry responsibility for them, follow their expectations, and above all else, never challenge the idealized image they are desperately trying to keep alive. That carefully constructed image means everything to them. A narcissist is not simply selfish in the ordinary ways that people can sometimes be selfish. Instead, they are constantly struggling to prevent an internal collapse. Their sense of identity is extremely fragile and unstable. It does not have the deep foundation upon which genuine confidence is built. It is not rooted in honesty, accountability, or authentic self-awareness. Because of this, they become heavily dependent on other people to prevent their self-esteem from disappearing. And this is precisely where you become part of their story. You were given a role, the caregiver, the constant admirer, the person who accepts the blame, the person who carries the emotional burden, the person who smooths over every difficult moment, and the person who forgives far more than they should. These are roles, not genuine relationships. And the moment you begin moving beyond the part they assign to you, the moment you start establishing boundaries, expressing your needs, or growing in a direction they cannot control, the entire dynamic begins to change. The narcissist does not attempt to understand your development or adjust their own behavior. Instead, they change their strategy. They may begin devaluing you, or they may eventually discard you completely, but regardless of which path they choose, it comes from the same internal mechanism. You are no longer serving the purpose of supporting the illusion they are determined to preserve. This is the heart of the problem. Your value to them depends almost entirely on how well you fit into the internal script they have created. You can see this pattern repeating across many different situations. It appears in romantic relationships when the moment you stop tolerating unfair or harmful behavior, you are suddenly described as being too much, too demanding, or too difficult. It appears in families when a child begins questioning the narcissistic parent's version of events and suddenly becomes the target of intense blame or is pushed away. It can also appear in workplaces where a highly capable employee who threatens a narcissistic boss may be undermined, lied about, discredited, or gradually forced out of the organization. This is not simply ordinary disagreement between two people. This is psychological objectification. You were not given the freedom to exist as your own person outside the specific framework created by the narcissist. Many people wonder whether a narcissist actually understands what they are doing. The answer is complicated. On the surface, they may not fully recognize the entire extent of their behavior, but at a deeper level, yes, they understand enough to recognize that they repeatedly take more than they give. They know, even if they refuse to acknowledge it, that they treat other people as instruments instead of equals. And this is where the emotional coldness begins to become visible. You could give them everything: your love, your time, your constant empathy, your patience, and your understanding, and they could still consider you replaceable because what they are truly attached to is not you. It is what you provide for them: praise, approval, obedience, emotional reassurance, validation, and support. When you stop offering those things, your humanity can become an inconvenience in their eyes. And perhaps the most confusing part is that they may turn around and accuse you of being selfish, uncaring, or emotionally distant. That is projection. Deep down, what they believe is that they are entitled to your devotion regardless of how they treat you. That assumption becomes embedded in the relationship from the very beginning. When you finally stop giving them what they expect, when you begin recognizing the manipulation for what it is and start creating distance, they experience it as betrayal. They do not necessarily feel betrayed because they value you as a human being. They feel betrayed because you have stopped supporting the story they constructed about themselves. You have changed the script they expected you to follow. And in their world, they believe they are the only person who has the right to change that script. This is why people often say that a narcissist never truly loved you. It is not simply a cruel statement. It points toward a painful reality. They did not love you for who you truly were. They loved what you did for them. They were not genuinely connecting with your heart, your dreams, your hopes, your fears, or your inner life. They were connecting with their own desperate need to be admired, obeyed, reassured, and kept under complete control. The saddest part is that you may have spent months or perhaps even years believing that your value depended on how well you performed the role they had given you. But that was not love. It was a one-sided exchange that had been carefully disguised as intimacy. What makes these narcissistic relationships even more confusing is the fact that the exact qualities that attracted the narcissist to you in the beginning are often the same qualities they later punish you for possessing. Your strength, emotional awareness, independence, compassion, and authentic kindness. These qualities draw them toward you, but not necessarily because they want to appreciate, respect, or cherish those qualities. They are drawn toward what those qualities can provide for their emotional world. And when those same qualities begin giving you the courage to see through the relationship, everything can suddenly change. They want to possess them. You represent something that they do not believe they possess within themselves. And within their distorted way of understanding the world, anything they feel they lack must either be controlled or completely destroyed. There is very little room for anything in between. During the early stages, they idealize you. This is the familiar beginning of the cycle. You are described as amazing, impressive, intuitive, and deeply admirable. To them, you seem almost perfect, but this admiration does not necessarily come from genuinely understanding who you are. It comes from projection. They are looking at an imagined version of you that perfectly matches what they need from you. As long as you do not disturb that fantasy, everything can appear to be moving smoothly. But sooner or later, something changes. Maybe you finally speak up about something unfair. Maybe you accomplish something in an area where they feel insecure. Perhaps you decide that they should finally be held accountable for the things they have done. Suddenly, the strength they once admired begins to look like a threat in their mind instead of an attractive quality. Now they are trapped inside a contradiction. They still want the benefits you bring into their life, but at the same time, your independence feels like a personal attack against them. So they slowly begin tearing you down. In the beginning, the behavior may be extremely subtle. It can appear as sarcasm, little insults disguised as jokes, quiet expressions of disapproval, or growing emotional coldness. Eventually, however, the behavior can become much more severe. They may begin relying on gaslighting, emotional manipulation, silent treatment, and direct forms of punishment. They behave this way because somewhere deep inside themselves, they recognize that they cannot match your emotional depth, awareness, or resilience. Instead of permitting your qualities to encourage them to grow, they feel smaller simply because you are present. And rather than admitting that painful feeling to themselves, they place the responsibility entirely on you. They tell you that you are too emotional, too demanding, too strong, too sensitive, or simply too much. But the deeper truth is that your presence can expose weaknesses they are working incredibly hard to hide. And that is something they find extremely difficult to tolerate. To understand this fully, we have to look underneath the surface. Genuine strength is not about dominance or control. Real strength comes from integrity. It is the ability to remain grounded without pretending to be somebody you are not. It is the willingness to confront reality rather than constantly running away from it. When you bring this kind of authentic strength into a relationship with a narcissist, you are not simply challenging their pride, you are challenging the entire structure of their internal world. Their world is built around falsehood, self-deception, manipulation, and constant control over how they are perceived by others. Your clarity interferes with that entire system. Your empathy can make it much harder for them to hide behind the masks they have carefully created. Your insight makes their behavior easier to identify for exactly what it is. Empathy can be especially threatening because genuine empathy notices contradictions. Genuine empathy asks sincere questions. Genuine empathy recognizes when something does not feel right. This kind of direct, honest awareness can become incredibly uncomfortable for someone who survives by constantly pretending. So instead of allowing themselves to be genuinely seen, they attack. They reshape your words until those words support the story they want everyone else to believe. They reverse the entire situation so they can present themselves as the hero or the victim. They make you feel guilty simply because you noticed what was happening. It is not that they are incapable of recognizing your strength. They absolutely recognize it. The problem is that they cannot comfortably allow you to keep that strength unless they believe they are the ones controlling it. And when they realize they cannot control it, they may attempt to weaken it until eventually it disappears. This is why so many people who survive these kinds of relationships eventually find themselves feeling deeply confused, emotionally exhausted, or even completely broken. Your strength was not simply ignored, it was actively turned against you. You were repeatedly made to feel as though something was wrong with you simply because you were being a complete, genuine, and authentic human being. The tragedy is that the narcissist can eventually destroy the very quality that attracted them to you in the first place. They damage the connection that, under different circumstances, might have created an opportunity for genuine growth. They do not necessarily behave this way because they are monsters, but because they are emotionally unequipped to manage a healthy and genuine human relationship. They simply do not know how to remain emotionally close to someone whose entire existence does not revolve around them. And so eventually Your strength becomes the explanation they use to justify their harmful behavior. They resent that strength because it reminds them of something they cannot comfortably confront within themselves. It reminds them of their emptiness, their deeply buried insecurity, and the frightening possibility that underneath everything, they may simply be ordinary. And that possibility can feel unbearable to someone whose entire identity depends on feeling exceptional, superior, or in control. So, what does all of this ultimately mean for you, the person who has been trapped inside this strange and painful cycle? It means you have to learn the difference between being genuinely valued and simply being used. You have to stop confusing admiration with love, particularly when that admiration exists primarily as a method of gaining control over you. Most importantly, you must finally understand that your strength was never the problem. Your strength was simply the one quality the narcissist could never completely bend, reshape, or mold to fit the fantasy they had created inside their own mind. Your strength remained a constant threat to their fragile illusion, and it always will. You can finally release yourself from carrying responsibility for their discomfort. You can finally stop twisting yourself into smaller and smaller versions of who you really are simply to protect their fragile ego. You can stop apologizing for emotions that were completely real and reactions that were entirely human. You can stop attempting to become a shield for someone who never truly intended to protect you in return. This is the major turning point that many people reach only after enduring an incredibly long and painful struggle. It is the moment when you finally recognize that your suffering was never the real problem. The real problem was the toxic environment that demanded you remain silent about your pain. Once you clearly recognize this truth, the entire dynamic of the relationship begins to fall apart. You start noticing how many times you held yourself back or hid your authentic self simply to make another person feel secure. You remember all those moments when you softened your truth, not because your words were wrong, but because you were afraid of the explosion you knew could happen if you dared to speak honestly. You begin to recognize how often you monitored your own behavior, your tone, your emotions, and even your natural reactions just to prevent conflict. You begin to see how you gradually transformed yourself into someone you barely recognized, not because that was what genuine love required, but because you desperately needed to survive the emotional environment surrounding you. You learned to remain quiet when you wanted to speak. You learned to question yourself when your instincts were telling you something was wrong. You learned to accept explanations that never truly made sense because challenging them felt too dangerous emotionally. And perhaps the hardest realization of all is understanding that you are not becoming smaller because you were weak. You were becoming smaller because you were constantly trying to create peace inside an environment where peace depended upon your silence. You were trying to protect the relationship by sacrificing pieces of yourself. You were trying to keep another person comfortable while slowly becoming uncomfortable inside your own identity. But there comes a point when you have to recognize that love should never require you to disappear. A healthy relationship should not demand that you abandon your intuition, silence your feelings, or constantly prove that you are worthy of basic respect. Your empathy should not become an invitation for someone else to manipulate you. Your patience should not become permission for someone else to repeatedly hurt you. Your strength should not become something you are expected to hide simply because another person feels threatened by it. When you finally understand this, something inside you begins to change. You no longer feel the same need to explain yourself endlessly. You no longer feel compelled to convince someone to understand what they have repeatedly chosen to misunderstand. You stop chasing validation from the very person who benefited from making you doubt yourself. And that is where your strength begins to return. Not because you suddenly become cold, not because you stop caring, not because you become cruel or indifferent. Your strength returns because you finally stop giving away your identity in exchange for temporary peace. You begin understanding that protecting your peace is not selfish. Speaking honestly is not cruelty. Having boundaries is not rejection. Walking away from manipulation is not failure. You begin choosing yourself without needing to hate the person who hurt you. You begin rebuilding the parts of yourself that were pushed into silence, and slowly the qualities that once made you feel like a problem begin to look completely different. Your sensitivity becomes awareness. Your empathy becomes discernment. Your independence becomes freedom. Your ability to recognize patterns becomes wisdom. The very qualities someone attempted to use against you can eventually become the qualities that help you rebuild your life. And this is why your strength mattered so much. It was never simply about being stronger than another person. It was about remaining connected to yourself when everything around you was encouraging you to abandon who you were. It was about keeping some part of your authentic identity alive even during the moments when you felt completely lost. You may have been made to believe that you were too much, but perhaps you were simply too honest for an environment built around pretending. You may have been called too sensitive, but perhaps you were simply noticing things that others were trying desperately to ignore. You may have been called difficult because you finally asked questions that were uncomfortable. You may have been criticized for becoming distant when, in reality, you were finally learning how to protect yourself. The goal now is not to prove your worth to the person who refused to recognize it. The goal is to recognize your own worth without requiring their approval. Because once you stop trying to convince someone of your value, their opinion begins losing the power it once had over you. Their criticism no longer defines you. Their rejection no longer determines your identity. Their attempts to make you feel guilty no longer automatically control your behavior. You begin realizing that you were never responsible for maintaining someone else's illusion of superiority. You were responsible for being honest with yourself. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside this entire experience. Sometimes the person who tried hardest to make you doubt your strength was the person most threatened by the possibility that you would finally recognize it. Your strength was never something you needed to apologize for. Your authenticity was never the problem. Your ability to see clearly was never a weakness. And your decision to stop shrinking yourself is not an act of revenge. It is an act of returning to yourself.